He comes to me at night. His name is Fred. And he keeps trying to take me to the boiler room. He wants to kill me.
What is a dream?
It is a portal between our inner and our outer world.
Information that comes to us while we are sleeping from another dimension, another reality.
What is a dream? Nobody really knows. You know, dreams are pretty amazing places, and it is possible to use them a bit, because I think that's what the mind is doing.
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
Throughout history, mankind has been fascinated by dreams and has strived to understand them and their role in our waking lives.
Dreams are considered important in virtually every culture in the world and throughout history. Some cultures would say this is the way that God speaks to us. Other people would say that there are other friendly spirits who are helping us with those dreams.
There is a universal awe of dreaming and a universal fear of dreaming. There's not a civilization in the world that hasn't developed a folklore deriving from dreams.
This is new.
These are ancient dream demons. Supposedly, they roam the dreams of the living. Then they give them the power to cross the line and turn our nightmares into reality.
We have actually records on clay tablets from the Assyrians in Mesopotamia. So our interest in dreams go back to what was the dawn of humankind.
Many ancient civilizations believed that dreams held special powers and organized their societies around them.
The Egyptians looked at dreams as prophetic. There were special dream interpreters, and they had prominence, especially if a king, a pharaoh, or someone of royalty would dream a dream. It was very, very important. The Greeks had an incredible dreaming culture for over 1,000 years. There were dream temples, about 400 of them. This was specifically for healing.
If you had a physical problem, disease, you would go to a temple where you would spend the night sleeping. And in this temple, there would be snakes all around you, crawling over you, until you had a dream, which gave you the information that you needed to have around the illness that you were dealing with.
The earlier cultures really looked at the different ways of approaching the dream itself.
Very often, people are looking for disclosure of the future. We find evidence of that in the Bible, Old Testament, dream of Joseph, dream of Jacob, Jacob's ladder. Also contact, let's say, with the divinities, with the gods and with the goddesses.
Native American cultures, dreams being very, very important. This is the Great Spirit. This is Wonkantanka talking to you. And so you pay great attention to them.
The Chinese, for example, believe that the spirit actually leaves the body during dream time.
They feel that the dream is an entry point into deeper worlds. And that sort of approach is quite frequent in the East, in other religions.
That's pretty. What is that?
This is my Malaysian dream doll. It's supposed to bring good dreams.
The Balinese were the culture that I discovered that was most interesting, because they have a system of kind of teaching their kids lucid dreaming, to be aware that they were dreaming while they were dreaming. It's a whole different way of looking at it. And then basically it's saying this is part of my mind, this can be used by me.
The important point here that every culture in the world pays attention to dreams and realizes that they have some importance.
People have always tried to make sense out of dreams, this behavior, and that, I'm sure, will continue, whether or not there's sense to be made of it, and I think that's the real issue.
What the hell are dreams, anyway?
Mysteries.
The truth is, we still don't know what they are or where they come from.
Do dreams serve some essential purpose for the human mind? Or are they simply a byproduct of normal brain activity? Science has not yet provided an answer.
There are many theories about why we have to dream, and none is really conclusive.
It may be that what you see is what you get, that dreams are just something that sort of spins off brain processes that are going on that have no real significance, and they may not be much more than that. It's still quite unclear whether there are some vital physiological processes that go on in sleep that don't happen at other times.
I don't see why you couldn't just give me a pill to keep me from dreaming.
Everyone's got to dream, young lady. If you don't dream, you go.
In 1900, Freud wrote a very influential book called The Interpretation of Dreams, where Freud indicated that dreams are important in understanding a person's neuroses, psychoses, their mental state of health, and showed how to work with dreams.
That really re-established, you might say, the importance of the dream in many ways in the culture and established it within the psychological discipline. The researches of Carl Jung was the next significant milestone.
Jung's idea was that they were kind of ancient symbols and sort of thought structures, and that we were all connected in some ways to each other at the base level of thought and feeling and dreams.
All day long I've been hearing those fingernails.
Fingernails? That made me remember the dream I had last night.
What'd you dream?
I dreamed about a guy in a dirty red and green sweater. Scream.
Nancy, you dreamed about the same creep I did.
Jung said, oh, dreams are telling us much more about what's going on. It's just not about us. It's about many things. And it's just not tapping into our lives now on an ego level. It's tapping into a much larger place, the place where Freddy Krueger lives.
Nightmares are the darker mysteries of the dream world. Do they come from a different place? Do they carry a more sinister message?
Out of all the chaos and the input that we deal with on a daily basis and we take in, our dreams need to process it and put it into a kind of a shape. Some of those shapes are nightmares.
Guys can have nightmares too, you know. You can get a corner on the market or something.
Many times people make distinctions between dreams and nightmares, and all a nightmare is a dream which brings really important information for us to understand, but the ego gets frightened by it.
It's dealing with things that are very, very unprocessed, or perhaps not reconciled or resolved in the mind yet. They are about blood, and they are about aggression, and they are about violence, and everything that we're taught not to be when we're kids, but is still lurking around there in very powerful ways in our subconscious all the time.
I know now that I brought him into my world. We all did. Gave him all the energy he needed. Our screams were all he needed.
And certainly in Nightmare on Elm Street, I felt like Freddy, beyond a character that somebody thought up, stood for tendencies of human beings, especially males, to be destructive and to want to slash and burn as opposed to nurture and protect.
The shadow part of ourselves, our psychological shadow, those parts of ourselves that we don't want to deal with, Mommy and Daddy told us not to deal with, or our society tells us not to deal with. We push it in the background, in the closet. It gets angry in that closet. It gets angry being pent up like that. And so when we let it out, when he comes out, he's angry as hell.
And so it will come and menace the individual in the dreams, and that's a good attention getter. When you scare somebody, that you sure get their attention.
I would say if we paid more attention to Freddy, dialogued with Freddy, get Freddy to cut his nails a little bit, love Freddy a little bit, he would transform into something else.
What other secrets does the sleeping mind hold? Are dreams powerful enough to affect our waking life?
We live in an age of sleep dysfunction. I mean, all you have to do is watch TV every night and see all the advertisements for sleep aids. There have been all kinds of reports recently of people taking, sleeping medications who wake up in the middle of a traffic accident and the last thing they remember was getting into bed.
The classic example I read in the New York Times about a year ago was a woman who got up, walked out on the street, went to a construction site, and woke up on something like the 4th story in one of those beams lying there. And they had to, rescue to get her down.
These people sometimes will even tie themselves to the bed after a while because it becomes so predictable. They can injure themselves, they can punch the wall or anyone with them. Obviously, after a little while, people learn not to sleep with them, but it really is acting out a dream.
While many instances of such activity have been recorded, no one really knows what humans are capable of. Can a person commit murder under the influence of a dream?
He took this knife and stabbed her over and over and over again.
In the middle of the night, Scott Falater stabbed his wife 44 times and dragged her body to the family swimming pool. He later claimed he had no knowledge of the crime and had been sleepwalking.
A murder being committed in a sleepwalking state is plausible. While he was sleepwalking, a dream could have been happening and he could have been acting it out in some way.
I assume that I must have gone crazy or that something in my head had broken.
We know that people can be aroused and their behavior changes rather dramatically, and typically they don't engage in really complicated behaviors. If you recorded his brainwave activity, you might find something unusual during this period, or you might find perfectly normal calculating behavior.
It's open to possibility. It doesn't mean that somebody's doing it in this case, that defense was correct. If you're accused of a murder, most people would do anything to avoid the consequences of that.
The simple explanation is that he woke up and he did it and he went back to sleep, not that he was asleep.
In this case, the jury agreed, and Scott Falater was convicted of murder. Perhaps even more frightening is the idea central to the Nightmare on Elm Street films, that dreams can be deadly to the dreamers themselves.
There is a kind of a superstition that if you die in a dream, you really die. But I think there's a bit of the urban legend going on there.
A lot of people die in their sleep. After all, it happens all the time. The question is whether someone can be killed by a nightmare.
Sudden, unexpected nocturnal death syndrome is something that's been widely reported, in which people die, apparently in the midst of nightmares.
All reports were the same. A person in apparently good health went to sleep and died. Often the victim displayed labored breathing, screams, and frantic movements just before death. The Centers for Disease Control investigated these mysterious deaths, but no medical cause has yet been found.
Wes Craven read some newspaper articles about this syndrome, and that was his immediate inspiration for the Nightmare series.
I just kind of noted it as something that was strange and weird, and doctors had not known what had caused it, but it had elements of the story that were really, almost you could lift them out of the newspaper story and put them into a movie.
Why do you want to stay awake?
Because if I fall asleep, I'm not waking up.
We don't know if anybody can be killed by a nightmare because they can't tell us.
Very few people whom you find dead in the morning are able to tell you what they dreamt before they died.
Are dreams a doorway to another world? Is there something sinister lurking in our nightmares waiting for us? The answer, much like dreams themselves, remains a mystery.
Dreams have always been with us. It's something we return to again and again, just as we return to it every night.
And now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
Nightmare on Elm Street is a bona fide classic in the same pantheon as The Exorcist, Psycho, and Night of the Living Dead.
Freddy certainly was a star, kind of the father figure who takes delight in killing innocents and delights in evil.
He became a character in American horror, the equal of Frankenstein and Dracula.
Just seemed like ancient tragedy in a way, so it felt very classical.
It was about the story, and it was a really, really good story.
This is a smart, interesting little movie. It deals with reality and fantasy blending.
It was one of my very first jobs at all. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into.
The scene in the bedroom where the girl is going up the wall.
Nobody's ever really done that kind of thing before.
No apologies, nothing politically correct about it. Pushing the envelope, Wes Craven, come on down.
Gonna get you.
When I try to think of where becoming a horror film director came from, I can only speculate. First of all, I never thought of making movies until I was almost 30. I was raised in a fundamentalist Baptist church. Almost all social things of any import were really within the church. And one of the beliefs they had, besides you can't play cards and dance and smoke and drink alcohol, was that you don't go to movies because they're kind of the devil's playground. My father was buried in '45, somewhere around my 6th birthday. The few memories that I have of my father, I was really scared of him. He had an explosive temper, and you had the feeling like he could kill you at any time. It was just, one of those kind of guys. My first year in college, I came down with this very strange, unexpected paralysis. And during that time, when I came fairly close to death, I started writing poetry. That and my love of books and novels started going into writing short stories and things like that, but none of them were, about horror. Films didn't really happen until I started teaching college. We had an art theater that showed all the European films, fantastic Bergman and Fellini films, this amazing sort of fluorescence of astonishing films. That was my notion, is I want to do something like that. Quit my job. I just went to New York to figure out how to make films. The whole idea of doing a horror film never would have occurred to me. Really, it just was a matter of my having been working for this guy, Sean Cunningham, who hired me to do some syncing up dailies.
Around 1970 is when I first started to make films. I really didn't know how, and I was learning how to make all of these mistakes and how to make movies. In the middle of all of that, I meet this guy named Wes Craven. He was a rock. I mean, he was a terrific assistant, and he became a really good editor. After we had worked together for almost a year, it was like, I've got an idea, let's make a movie. We were able to get some people to put up money because of our previous relationship.
Sean said, the backers want a scary movie. Do you ever think of writing something scary? I said, no. He said, well, go write something scary, and if they like it, you can direct it. On a weekend, in 3 days, I wrote Last House on the Left. Kind of a raucous, balls-to-the-walls, escaped criminals doing horrible things movie.
The picture turned out to be very, very strong. You got to see Wes's special sensitivity for this scary, dark arena.
I don't think Sean or I thought that anybody would really see it. When it opened, it kind of created a sensation, and there were riots and protests, and people tried to get into the projection booth to destroy it. I felt like, hey, maybe we got something here.
After Last House was released, Wes felt that he had his sample reel and had a kind of a hit movie.
Actually, after Last House, I didn't make another film for, I think, almost 5 years because I was trying to do other kinds of films. And then at a certain point, my friend said, I can get you money to make a scary movie, write something else scary. That became Hills Have Eyes.
The Hills Have Eyes, another sort of strange, stark, semi-horror thing which he was able to get done. And at the same time, Wes had moved to California, was trying to make his career here and got to do a couple of movies. Wes became a successful director, but he's still haunted by this idea of going back and trying to do this special movie.
Nightmare was written after I'd done 2 films back to back. I had made enough money on them to take 6 months off. So I basically took 6 months off and wrote and refined the script, Nightmare on Elm Street. Nightmare on Elm Street as a story seems to have its roots in these articles in the Los Angeles Times. The first article was about a young man, Asian descent, dying in the middle of a nightmare. He and the family had come out of relocation camps in Southeast Asia during the time of Pol Pot, when hundreds of thousands of people were just being slaughtered. About a year later, there was a second article. Then about 6 months later, the third, and the third one just got me. That was a young man whose father was a doctor. They had come out of relocation camps. He was having nightmares, and he was telling his family that there's something after me, and I'm afraid if I don't stay awake, it'll kill me. This kid decided he was going to stay awake. Sleeping pills the father had been demanding that he take were found under his pillow. He hadn't taken any of them. And he had a coffee pot in his closet full of black coffee with a long extension cord that he had hidden behind curtains. They were all sitting in the living room watching a movie, and he just kind of fell asleep. Carried him upstairs, put him to bed, pulled the covers over him, and everybody goes, thank God. Everybody goes to bed in the middle of the night. They hear screaming. They run into his room, and before they get to him, he is dead. Oh man, I got to do a movie about that.
There are so many horror films that have used the dream motif. If we go back to The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the entire film is seen as a nightmare. They chose to make the sets distorted, expressionistic, nightmarish. But there was never a situation where a character lived exclusively in a dream world.
Since I was in college, I've been writing down dreams and remembering my dreams, so I was kind of familiar with the whole landscape. I've always felt like nightmares are the horror movies of the psyche. Conversely, horror films are kind of the nightmares of a culture. They talk about the things that our normal, rational mind or our polite society doesn't really want to bring to the dinner table. I was trying with Nightmare on Elm Street to think in archetypes. It was very much built on a system of kind of archetypical thinking and nightmares.
It was right in there that Wes started to talk to me about this character that operated in dreams and was able to cross over into real life.
Right away, I thought, you have to have an antagonist. You have to have the killer. And then it was a matter of just kind of designing him. By that time, Halloween had come out and Friday the 13th had come out, and they both were very powerful and successful films, and they had somebody in a mask. At a certain point I thought, kill him in fire, and then he can have a mask of just scar tissue, and yet he'll be able to be articulate.
Fred Krueger, Mom! Fred Krueger!
Freddy, the name, was the name of a kid who used to beat me up quite frequently.
Where are you, Krueger?
Krueger sounded very German and reminded me of one of the big war plants in Nazi Germany, and also it was an extension of Krug, who was the lead character in Last House on the Left. Freddy's hat was exactly the hat of a man who had scared me when I was a little kid, who I think was a drunk walking down the street. He just somehow knew I was there, and he stopped and he looked right at me and just held that. It just scared the shit out of me. His sweater colors were out of an article I read in Scientific American that these two colors were the most difficult for the human cornea or human eye to put side by side. The claws were the sort of pièce de résistance, and it was like, well, what does he have? Does he have a knife? Does he have a sickle? I think at that time we had a cat, and I just saw the cat doing this. You know, I was like, oh, yeah, right.
You want to know who Fred Krueger was? He was a filthy child murderer who killed at least 20 kids in the neighborhood.
The worst crime imaginable to me is to harm a child. The fact that he was a child murderer and a child molester was just about the most loathsome creature I could imagine on the level of what he did. The big problem was, how do you fight somebody like that? It became a matter of having a central character, Nancy, that dared to go into the nightmares, go into his territory. That's when I started poking around lucid dreaming and that concept that you can go into a dream and be awake. And I just invented this little conceit that if you were holding something when you woke up, it would come with you back into your reality.
I brought something out from my tree.
I would tell it in about a minute, and people would go, oh, I'd go see that in a second.
In the early 80s, I think Wes had his first draft of the script, and the agent had shopped it around. Most people just said, I don't know if it'll work. I just don't you have anything else? The only person that believed in it was Bob Shaye. Bob was running New Line Pictures, which I think at the time was a 16mm distribution company.
At that time, Bob Shaye and New Line Cinema were a tiny little, almost a storefront in lower Manhattan. That wasn't who I wanted to, make the movie for 10 cents, so it went around to Hollywood too, but nobody got it except Bob.
I said I thought that sounded fantastic because it had an element that I'm always looking for, which is something that all audiences can relate to, and everybody, of course, could relate to scary dreams and nightmares.
Bob absolutely believed that Wes was onto something, and he wanted a shot at the big time. The bad news is Bob didn't have any money. He spent months and months, if not years, trying to get the money together to shoot this movie.
with great pain and suffering, I will tell you that. As much the pain and suffering you go through making a film is nowhere near the pain and suffering you go through financing it. In this case, I had to raise all the money outside.
He raised the money basically, I'm sure, from his own money, and I'm sure from friends and family. And then he was looking for the major investor. Smart Egg was going to advance him $1 million for the picture. A week later, he called me and said they dropped out.
Just about 2 weeks before we started shooting, he basically said, "You guys should all just go home and I'll call you if I find money." And it was like, oh man, so close, you know.
Bob told me, go back to LA and tell everyone that they're going to have to just work for free for a while. John Burroughs, our line producer, put up his own money.
I'll use my credit card and I'll pay the crew. It was like $8,000 or $9,000.
I remember at that time, Bob has a thing about fingernails and kind of digging at them, and I looked over and they were all just bloody, and I realized the incredible amount of stress that comes from raising money and trying to get back into a picture. Somehow he found the money.
We had one final meeting with Media Home Entertainment, a guy named Joe Wolf who owned that company, and they were big home video distributors. Finally made a deal where Joe Wolf could take over the whole movie if I didn't get my commitment together in 3 or 4 weeks. I managed to then go to the Smart Egg guy and browbeat him into agreeing to put up the last few $100,000.
Bob didn't like it, but he had to take it. He was stuck. We went ahead and made the picture, but Bob will always remember that he was really giving his blood. You know, he said, "John, I hate it, I hate it, I hate it." The casting director was Annette Benson. She started bringing in people for Wes to talk to.
You know, you make a lot of decisions when you start off on a film in casting that you're going to be married to, and if you make one wrong decision, it can just kill the film. Nancy was played by this young woman who walked into the casting office, Heather Langenkamp. There was just nothing pretentious about her, but she was smart. She had an open face. She had a strong face.
I remember the interview really well because it was the scene where I'm describing how my dream had this guy in it with fingernails, and I remember, you know, making that sound.
Nancy.
I remember looking at Wes, and I could tell he really liked it.
He knew immediately that Heather was the right look, because he wanted a young girl who was smart looking, obviously pretty, vulnerable, but clearly had a good head on her shoulders.
I'm into survival.
The character that I love the most and have identified with the most is Nancy Thompson. She had a great sense that she could solve problems without anybody's help at all. I try to be like her, actually. Nancy definitely was this good girl, and her best friend, Tina, you get the feeling like she just isn't going to make it.
When Wes cast me as Tina, I just completed my acting program. My agents at the time called and said, "You have an audition for this horror film." The thought behind it was that I'd be the sort of Janet Leigh character, and in the first couple scenes of the film you would think that I was going to be the heroine.
That was obviously his lead. It was going to be his heroine. You found out a lot about her, and then you killed her.
The device shown just to make it clear that I'm not going to be the heroine. Obviously when I die, that's a clear indicator.
Rob was played by Nick Corey.
Guys can have nightmares too, you know.
He was a very interesting actor. He had a lot of soul, I thought, and a lot of empathy.
I probably could have saved if I'd have moved sooner.
He felt like he could play a character who wasn't a bad guy, but he hadn't had the breaks that everybody else had had.
Johnny Depp had never acted, and Wes liked him and liked his look.
Hi, how you doing?
It came down to 3 guys. Johnny Depp was one, and there was just a name. I said, well, I'm thinking of this guy, which is not Johnny, and my daughter and her friend said, "Dad, Johnny Depp." Oh, he's sexy. He's so sexy. He's a dreamboat.
Sexy and hot and good looking.
His was a little bit more of a goody two-shoes character than I'm sure he was in real life. You know, he played such a pure as the driven snow kind of guy.
Why would anybody want to kill me?
Johnny had never been, to my knowledge, in front of a camera before.
I won't screw up.
He was just terrified that he wasn't doing a good job.
Woo!
You know, after we were shooting a while, I said, "Johnny, you're doing great."
One of the conditions when we got the rest of our money was that we needed to have a name, at least a name or two, so that we could sell the picture foreign. We were so excited by the fact that John Saxon was willing to do it. John Saxon came on board, and he was quite a name at that time.
He was a very well-known actor, and he had been part of the Hollywood studio system before it was disbanded in the 60s.
He was a heartthrob when I was growing up in Caldwell, Idaho. He was the kind of actor that girls sent away for the 8x10 glossy.
How you doing, baby?
He played my dad perfectly, and I felt very secure at all times when I was around him and acting with him.
Ronnie Blakely played Nancy's mother.
Are you okay?
She had been in Nashville, the Robert Altman film.
Fred Krueger can't come after you, Nancy. He's dead.
Ronnie Blakely, she had an incredible life. She'd hung out with Bob Dylan, and she had been nominated for an Academy Award.
When I met Wes Craven, I was somewhat surprised to see that he was such an elegant, soft-spoken man. It was a thrill to work with him, and he couldn't have been nicer.
Are you okay? I'm okay.
I felt very close and friendly with Heather and admired her a great deal, so we hit it off very well.
We actually did spend a day or two together before the shoot where we went out and shopped for prom dresses at the Galleria, pretending that she was my mom at the mall. I loved this scene in the kitchen where she's treating me like I am crazy. She slaps me. Ronnie really slapped me. We both were very buried in that scene.
The casting of Freddie was a really big deal. I mean, it would rise and fall on Freddie. My first thought was that because of the physicality of the role, I should go with somebody who was like a stuntman. It was very quickly apparent that they were not in connection with that part of their psyche at all. And then in comes Robert Englund.
I think I'd done maybe 12 movies before I did Nightmare on Elm Street, but what happened to me was I finally stepped into television. I did this miniseries called V, which was sort of breakout for me. That was sort of my first taste of celebrity. In my hiatus from that, that's when I auditioned for Nightmare on Elm Street. My buddy smoked, and he'd ridden over with me, and I'd used some ash from the ashtray in my car, which is an old makeup theater trick, and put a little bit of circles under my eyes. It looks very, very real. You can fool people with it. I just sat there and stared back at Wes.
Wes came out of the meeting and Robert had left, and he told me, he said, you know, he said, this man can do this.
He was just full of piss and vinegar, and he just loved the role. And he said, I just can't wait to sink my teeth into this.
When Wes started to shoot Nightmare, there was enormous pressure on him because he had believed in it for so long, and now it was sort of like put up or shut up. And he was working with an insufficient budget and a very short shooting schedule, trying to figure out how to do it.
I think we had something like 32 days. It was tight. It was very, very tight. You know, as a director, you just never know whether you can cram all of that, 10 pounds of stuff into a 5-pound bag.
It was a small budget movie that pretended to be a big budget movie with multi-units. We did not have a lot of time for what we had to do.
But we found very talented people who were willing to work for the money we had and were able to take a few $1,000s and turn it into a bed spurting blood or something like that.
Cinematographer was Jacques Haken, an absolute perfectionist. He wore an eye patch when he was shooting, and when we asked him why he did that, he said, because I don't want to close my eye, but I don't want any distraction, so the eye that was not to the lens had an eye patch.
He was one of these cameramen that in the screening room when we ran the dailies, he'd run up to the screen from his seat. Oh my God, look at the lighting over here in this corner. But his work was good. His work was beautiful. Wes had dreamt up all kinds of weird things, and he would get together with Haken. He and Wes were working very tightly together to get what they wanted.
We do plan shots. There's a lot of storyboarding involved, and it's very premeditated. But you still have to leave room open for free thinking. You see a hand and your eye is drawn to it. There's your close-up of the glove. And watch Robert Englund, sort of flip out in that makeup and go, where's the heat? And make sure we get that on the film.
The shooting was done at Desilu Studios, what used to be the old Desilu that some independent equipment house had purchased.
We rented the space and we actually built the whole house on the stage, first and second floor. Then we shot in West Hollywood.
There's a wonderful little street called Genesee that when you pull onto it, it's like you're in the Midwest. It just has beautiful overarching trees. So that was our exterior location.
It's a very noticeable house. I do remember it really vividly. A lot of the scenes at that front door and the rose bushes and the trellis, I do hope those people forgave us for anything that we broke.
The neighborhood was very upset at us. There wasn't too many films going around on the streets in those days. Then they became interested in the picture when they saw a shooting at night and when Freddie was out walking around. Oh, look at him, there he is, I told you, what a gruesome. And so we were starting to get crowds coming around.
And then we shot in Venice, California, some of the back alley stuff.
I've often thought, I wonder what all those neighbors thought in the middle of the night, because I was screaming at the top of my lungs running down this alley.
The boiler room was a power plant of the Lincoln Heights jail. We went down and looked at the basement, and it was just perfect.
We looked at a lot of boiler rooms, and most of them were very clean and kind of, contemporary, and I wanted something very dungeon-like. And this one just fit the bill.
It was just creepy. I mean, it was clearly a place filled with so much anguished emotion. God only knows what happened in there.
All the pipes had been wrapped in this insulation, and it was all broken open, and this stuff was falling out. A year later, we discovered that the place had been closed down because it was just full of asbestos, and I realized we were all in there sucking up asbestos for like a week.
It's guerrilla filmmaking. One had to really be prepared and stay immersed in what you were doing because the whole movie is special effects.
I just kind of assumed that that's the way movies were made in Hollywood, Only lately when I see like how the A-list stars are treated, I'm like, wow, that was really low budget, wasn't it? But I had nothing to compare it to, so I was perfectly happy. We laughed a lot on the set.
In a horror movie, there's so many ludicrous things going on with the stage blood and the makeup and the melodramatic style of acting sometimes that you really have to embrace because everything around you is larger than life. But you kind of got to giggle, and Wes certainly knows that and encourages a little bit of that so then you can get down to business.
Freddie's makeup, of course. Wes Craven, he gave me the original script and basically gave me a little description of what he thought Freddie should look like. I did 5 different sculptures of what I thought Freddie should look like based on burn makeups. I did a lot of research. Wes kind of mixed and matched different things on each sculpture, and then we came up with a final look. When I first showed Robert, he was just excited. It was going to be a lot of fun to play this character.
I thought, the makeup is so extensive that I need some humanity, and my eyes, my darting little beady eyes, will be the humanity.
It took 3 hours. I think it was about 11 different pieces we had to glue down, because I had under pieces that glued down that showed the muscle, and then over that I put melted flesh kind of pieces, and I wanted it to move independently so you'd see his muscles moving underneath. When he first got into it, it was almost like he was afraid to move around, like it was gonna fall off or something. And he goes, "This is amazing, it all holds together and it moves," and he started moving his mouth around and moving his eyebrows, and he was just all excited after that.
I remember the first time I saw Robert Englund wearing his Freddie makeup. It was so strange.
I did not know what special effects makeup could do to a person.
It was just so gruesome and so shiny and oozy.
He couldn't get out of it once he was in it. So, for example, if we ate lunch, there Freddie would be having lunch, which isn't exactly what you want to see across the lunch table.
It got very difficult for Robert towards the end because his face was nearly raw from all the makeup. It got to the point where at the end of the day, he wouldn't even wait for me to come and take it off carefully with solvents and things. He would just rip the whole mask off.
This is God. The famous glove, Freddy Krueger's glove. The original description in the script was fairly loose. Wes had a vision sort of in his mind of what it could do, but not how it was. He made the suggestion that it needs to be something that the guy could make himself with the things that you find in a boiler room. I did a sketch, a side view sketch of what the whole thing would look like, just to work out the geometry, how's this thing going to move, where the rivets need to be, how's it attached to the glove. And then I handed the work off to Lou Carlucci and Charlie Bellardinelli, who were 2 of my guys, to actually build the glove itself. We wanted to use a commercially available knife. This little Echo steak knife was the most brutal looking thing. Reground, remounted on the glove to make those long talons. I remember the first time Robert tried the glove on. First thing he did was cut himself, like everybody did, because we didn't realize that if you folded your fingers all the way, the knives went into your wrist. But then he sort of looked at Wes and got that smile on his face and went,
That became his look with the glove.
Gonna get you. I really began to play with it. You know, and that would be what happened to me. I remember playing around in craft service and goofing in craft service with it, you know, putting different, you know, jujubes and marshmallows and putting jelly on it, making it look like guts and stuff like that. That's when I really got comfortable with it and really began to really get it into the frame.
It's gotta be the scariest looking thing. It just looks so homemade. It looked like something that some psychopath would have made. They had several different ones. They had sharp ones and plastic ones and non-sharp ones. And whenever Freddy would grab me, I'd say, this is the not sharp one, right? You know? And often they would forgotten to switch him out. He's like, oh no, this is the sharp one. Yeah, it caused a lot of nightmares.
It was very strange to see Robert interact with people. He went from being this nice guy and real talkative and everything, and then all of a sudden you'd hear action. You just see this whole dark cloud come over.
Speed, marker. Once he put it all on, he sort of got into the character. He enjoyed playing that part. He relished it.
Tina, watch this.
I could tell that there was a really strong actor playing the role. There was something there that was going to be a real-life, breathing character.
Robert Englund was a classically trained actor at the Royal Academy. He really brought this character to life as if he was playing a Shakespearean role. He would practice movements that would be extremely dramatic. There's so much drama to every single line that he delivered.
What I took was Klaus Kinski. I was really impressed with his Nosferatu, and I took the thrusted neck that Klaus did on that. And then the other one was, there was a certain kind of, you know, a you dirty rat kind of swagger that Jimmy Cagney had that I wanted to bring to Freddy. Sometimes even walking crossover like a surfer walks on a surfboard or like a runway model. It gives Freddy a kind of a glide. I remember seeing there once, and Johnny and Heather were sitting there getting makeup on as if they needed it, these two beautiful young kids. And here I am, and I'm getting basted with a turkey baster full of KY jelly. I envied them. I envied them their youth. I envied their beauty. A light bulb went off. I could use this as Freddy. It was a shorthand for me to get angry.
I'm gonna split you in two.
This was a guy that knows what's in your underwear drawer. This is a guy that knows what you're afraid of. This is a guy who knows what's in your diary. This is a guy that knows your weakness and can exploit that, and that's a real violation. Look, all better for me, but not for you.
Wes Craven had a tremendous mind for effects. He was so good. I could sit there and he'd tell me what he's going to do, and I'd say, well, we can't shoot that, Wes. We can't. Jim Doyle was our effects man. When Wes would talk to him, he'd understand.
Nightmare was a low budget movie for what they were attempting to do especially. I think we had 80 effect shots in a 90-minute film. Wes, being an experienced low-budget director at that point, was able to use the budget to his advantage.
My feeling about special effects were twofold. One, I wasn't terribly expert in it. And two, I couldn't afford them anyway. So everything was pretty much practical, which is a film term for just done physically.
We worked our way through ideas for some of these nightmares that would give him the bang on the screen.
Every scene has some really innovative effect in it. Wes was always the instigator. Any idea would be great. Okay, how are we going to make that today? The very first one was in the alleyway when Freddy's arms stretch across the alley. The idea seemed so simple, and yet the effect was so bizarre. It was just something that you weren't expecting at all.
Oh, the alley scene, yes, that was very high-tech. His arms stretching out were literally a guy on two garage roofs, one on each side of the alley, with a fish pole.
They were air-assisted to be able to extend, and then they were just marionetted from two guys with fishing pole rigs, one in each garage on each side. That's as complicated as that had to be.
Freddy's face getting pulled off, that was a puppet. I had to build a whole puppet of Robert, head and torso, and I had to put his face on, but I couldn't glue it down because it had to smear off like really easy. So I just used KY jelly and just loaded it in there on the skull face.
I think it was one take, just... Much of that stuff was just very, very, very simply done.
Simple one was he wanted to have a figure pressing against the wall then showing the whole figure of the man. I said, how are we going to shoot that?
That scene, they literally, I remember at 8 in the morning, they're like, how are we going to do this? And Jim Doyle's like, well, I really think we should just go out and buy this new material. It's called spandex.
Yeah, the rubber wall that everybody thinks is rubber. I went off down the fabric store and got spandex. So then we just made a panel of it, stuck it over the bed, and pushed on it a couple times, and it was like, this might work. That would be me. That would be my face, is Freddie in that particular shot.
Nancy stirs.
I think that's my hero shot.
Freddie's got to come back. We didn't know what it would look like. I just said, just press your face against it and press your hand out. And we'll see how it looks. And we looked at it like, whoa, that's really terrific. But, you know, it cost 10 cents.
Of course, the bathtub scene, which is probably people's favorite scene. Just that idea of the claw coming up through the water between my legs while I'm sleeping in the bathtub. How are we going to do this? Well, you're going to be on this little box in the bathtub, and then we're going to have Jim Doyle from underneath who's going to, stick the claw up through the bathwater bubbles. I'm like, okay, you guys have obviously thought about this more than I have.
It wasn't a difficult thing to do. We just cut a hole under the bathtub, cut a hole in the bathtub, sealed a tank below. And action. I just held my breath and just would, duck under the water when Wes said action, and I could hear him because he was right next to the wall, so I could hear him through the wall. And I just took cues from him.
Right, too high.
And had to be really, really, really careful because that was the sharp glove.
And up.
I loathe to admit that's not me between Heather's legs in the tub. I'm just Jim Doyle again, working 24/7.
No, get up, Jim.
Okay, Jim, ready? Take your breath.
Are you ready? As soon as he's under, I'll start. Yell action, I guess.
As soon as you're ready, Jim. Action.
Underwater. That was all done at a pool with black plastic sheeting so that you couldn't tell how deep the pool was. It looked like it went forever down there.
We all went under that Viz Queen on scuba equipment. We all thought we were going to drown. We just thought this is the most dangerous thing we've ever done.
There's some props that the special effects guys bring onto the set. I think Wes invents these kinds of things to just get me. I have to get over that, and it usually takes me a couple of minutes.
I was in the lab one day putting the phone together with the mouth and the mechanical tongue. It was a cable-operated tongue device, so he could make it go up or down, left and right, and pull it in and out.
It was just like a simple prop, and all it did was just that.
Then when I saw how it worked, and I saw the line that was going to be read, I knew that would become one of the most famous lines from the movie. It just had all the ingredients of being one of those great movie lines.
The thing I walked away the most from the entire film was that I felt that it was a film about blood.
No!
There was every scene was too much blood, not enough blood, the blood's not red enough, the blood's too sticky, the blood's too thin, cue the blood, more blood, less blood, splash the blood. I clearly had read it and interestingly enough not really processed some of the more adventurous things I was going to have to do. One day on the set, a prop guy came up to me and was like, oh, now, just wanted to show you the body bag. And I'm like, all right, I don't know why you're showing me. That was awful, being in that body bag. Your psyche does not want to be in that bag. You hear about body bags, you're just not supposed to be in one. Also because I was sharing it with creatures. I had to stand in this bag with these things. It was just awful. I was terrified and grossed out, and I thought, this is just awful. Centipede? Wait, I don't remember reading that in the script. They shot with my face with a rubber centipede, me pushing it out, and then they used the cast face with a real centipede. I don't know what this has to do with acting. I don't think I want to do this.
The biggest thing in the picture was the revolving room.
The upside-down room that they used with Tina, who was shown to be on the ceiling. I had no idea how they were going to do that when I saw the script. I'm still not absolutely clear how they did do it on production.
It was critical that Tina's death had to be something that was completely otherworldly and completely confusing to the audience. The idea actually came from the Fred Astaire film Royal Wedding, which had a great sequence of him dancing around the rotating room. You can do that? I said, well, I think we can. So I went ahead and looked at the logistics. So yeah, I think we can do this. We spent a month to get this thing done. Built the framework and then built the room inside of that.
All sorts of superstructure underneath because it had to kind of have a structural integrity no matter what attitude it was in.
Floors, walls, ceiling, everything is framed in 2x6s and double layer plywood because nothing can move. Every little thing had to be reconsidered. What are the decorations in the room? How are we going to nail them down when the room turns?
Everything in the room, all the curtains, anything that would flop or move was just starched to hell or pinned down. We strapped Amanda's boyfriend down to the floor. We had his hair totally lacquered. And then there were two kind of jump seats that were bolted to the wall, and the camera was bolted to the wall.
The cameraman had himself strapped into a chair, and he kept the camera on, and he went around with the room.
We turned the room by hand, me and 3 or 4 guys. It was very spooky when it was turning all by itself.
It was horrifying. I mean, it was the only scene I think I've ever been part of that was more frightening in real life. What if it falls off its hinges? Or what if somebody falls out of the hole and lands on the ground? It just seemed like so much could go wrong.
I was pretty scared going into that. I was afraid for my own physical safety because I kept thinking things were going to fall on me. I thought I was going to fall out. This has a lot of elements to it that seem really dangerous.
We shot the whole sequence and just dragged Amanda up the wall. It just was the spookiest thing in the world. The only thing was, as soon as anybody walked into the room, they got totally nauseous because it was so disorienting.
I look up and there's the bed above me. Completely freak out. I get complete and utter vertigo and I start to feel that I'm falling. Wes's head comes through this hole in the floor and he's like, look, I am standing on the floor. This is my head. You're on the floor. You're looking right at me.
Amanda, this is down, this is up, this is down, this is up, just before the take.
And action.
Just the most bizarre thing I've ever been asked to do. It was a mess doing the whole thing.
And then we took the same room and used it as Johnny Depp's room for the bed sequence. The part pulling him down through the bed was easy, but then when the mother comes in and sees all the blood come out, we inverted the room.
It's actually inspired by Kubrick a little bit, because The Shining had come out, and there was that scene with the blood spilling out of the elevators.
I thought if you could get away with it, I could.
Roughly 220 gallons of the blood, as we called it. This was actually made with water, with food coloring and a little bit of poster paint to make it thick. It was stored on a scaffolding above the stage.
Imagine it's like a lottery drum, and there's a platform with guys waiting at the top. The drum turns, and when it hits the mark, boom, and that's the bed.
Nobody could see anything because the room was all closed. All we could hear was this thunderous pounding on the floor, which was now the ceiling, of all this blood dumping into the room. It was probably about 30 of the most exciting seconds I've had on a film set.
The stunt coordinator was Tony Caesar. He did some really hard falls. There's a scene where Freddy gets knocked by the sledgehammer and falls backward over the railing. I thought he had broken his neck for sure because his body rotated and he just turned his head sideways for a split second and hit that thing like a ton of bricks. The whole plywood, which was like, 3/4 inch plywood, was cracked.
His specialty was burn scenes, where he would paint his body with filament and light himself.
This guy was supposedly one of the top body burn guys in the business. This guy's nuts. He's good. He knows what he's doing.
He did what he said was the longest fire burn done to that time when Freddy was caught on fire in the basement, runs up the stairs.
I couldn't believe this guy was actually doing this. It's nuts. We're sitting there with the fire extinguishers. When is he going to stop? He rolls back down the stairs on fire. Nobody'd ever done that before. Gets up, starts back up the stairs. And we're like, okay. Finally, he went down, hot enough, and we put him out.
They put him out and he stood up and said how to go. So he was pretty amazing.
At the end, as we were finally winding down, and I'm sure the money was running out, there were some days where there were some extra people on the set kind of looking at us, and I got the sense like, okay, these must be money people, and they must be nervous that we're not done yet.
In the middle of all of this, I was talking to Wes and asking him how it was going, and he was telling me about the shortage of time and money and so on, and I volunteered to come in and try to shoot second unit to pick up shots, and I said, look, just tell me what you need, and I'll go try to get the shots. You'd work for 12 or 14 or 15 hours, and you wouldn't get everything that was on the call sheet.
My day-to-day concerns were keeping people working. We had growing discontent with the crew because we were falling behind.
I asked Bob, what do I do? I've never produced before. I've never represented a studio on a production. Bob said, just keep pacing back and forth, looking at your watch, and sign.
One day, we were doing an inside scene where I was running through the alley and I'm being pursued by Freddy. Cut my foot open, and I remember Bob Shea going like, do you really have to go to the hospital and get stitches? I'm like, I think I do. Oh, this actress, gosh, so what? Her foot is bleeding a little bit.
The scene where Heather puts her foot in the carpet and it sinks through, that was one of my dreams, one of the horrible dreams that I had had when I was a kid.
Wes said, okay, Bob, this is your idea. If you think it's so great, why don't you direct this scene?
Yeah, well, no, it was one of the times that Bob visited the set, and it was towards the end, very, very end of the shoot, and I think it was about the time he was getting ready to pull the plug. Bob was standing right behind me saying, you got to shoot, you can't do that, cut this scene. I said, Bob, why don't you direct it?
Wes deigned to let me do it, mostly because if somebody didn't do it, it wouldn't have happened, and I thought it was an important part in the movie. The ending of the film was a huge conundrum. Wes wanted Heather to come out of the house, turn to her mother and say, well, God, I had this very strange dream last night, and then go off to school. But I didn't think as a commercial matter it was the kind of thing that was going to work. In the good horror films I've seen, there's always a twist at the end that scares you a lot. I begged him to write some kind of twist.
There we go, ready, and action.
Bob wanted a car to pull up and Nancy to get into it and then see Freddie at the wheel. We had a lot of arguments about that.
Wes said, that's terrible. It's really bad. You're screwing up the whole thing. And so he tried, and I tried, and we all were working on different things.
It is a little disconcerting shooting all sorts of different endings as an actor. Who's in charge here? Let's just make an ending. Let's just get this over with.
Bob wanted to have a hook for a sequel. I thought it was demeaning to the picture, didn't need it, and all those things. But I have to say, was very grateful to Bob for making the picture possible. So we reached a compromise. Freddie wouldn't be driving, but the car itself would have Freddie's stripes.
And then you cut to the mother, which is one of my favorite things.
Bob, we have to have this last shot of, pulling Ronnie Blakely through the door. You don't need that shot. Give us one shot. Okay, you can have one shot. And so we rolled, and that thing just flew through that. I don't know how they did it, but, it was one take, and we were out of there. We shut down, and that was it.
The editing was done in New York. That was obviously because we didn't even have an office out here at this point.
The first time I saw the film, Bob and the editor and I sat in a screening room and they rolled the film. Film finished and the lights came up and there was a long pause, and then Bob turned around, put his arm over the chair, I'll never forget this, and looked at me and says, do you think there's a film there at all? I said, yeah. I think we cut for, 4 or 5 weeks. Suddenly this terrific film emerged.
It was intense, but very, very exciting. The big challenge was how much to show of him physically. We didn't want to overdo it in terms of the scary thing in the movie being too much in your face. And of course his voice was so good as well that he was able to create tension without seeing him.
One of the really effective things about this movie is that when you're shifting between the nightmares and dreams and actual reality, it's not that obvious.
I thought it was great what Wes was doing, because half the time I couldn't tell what was a dream and what was reality, even in the dailies. It fed in beautifully into what we tried to do editorially, which was kind of seamlessly go from reality into dreams. I think it played into the movie in a really wonderful way, so that often you wouldn't quite know where you were. The sound of Freddie's fingers rubbing on metal. Wes spent quite a bit of time with the sound editors getting just the kind of sound that would make your spine tingle.
Then we hired a composer, Charles Bernstein, who turned out to be brilliant.
This was a very low-budget situation. So our early conversations were kind of about how we were going to do this thing on very little money. I suggested to Wes, maybe I'll do this thing at home, and I'll play all the instruments, and I'll sing all the parts. I think I can do this thing without an orchestra.
I want to have a theme to the music that is unmistakable and that we can have reoccurring throughout. And I'd written this little doggerel thing in the film, 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, 3, 4, better lock your door. I said, maybe you could set that to music.
Da, 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 da.
1, 2, Freddy's coming for you.
It's very thematic, but I wanted it to have a melody. Da da dee da 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 da.
We had to deal with the rating board, which made us cut some things they didn't like.
You know, I tend to block bad memories, but I do remember that the whole blood coming out of the bed had to be cut short. And I know that we had to cut short Amanda when she hit the bed. There was a big splash of blood. They made us cut that off very short. It was extremely painful to have to do that. I still, to this day, hate that sort of censorship.
I really started getting excited when we took the film to MIFED in Milan, which is a foreign film sales convention. All of the skeptical investors and home video people and all the yada, all of a sudden they would get very quiet when they walked out. Everybody had a sense that this was a film that was really going to work.
Everything is together. We've got a release date. Publicity was out and the TV spots and everything had been done. It was a big deal for us. The week before we were supposed to open, the lab we were using wouldn't release the negative because they hadn't been paid. We didn't have the money to pay them. Bob somehow worked out some kind of deal to pay the lab all of their costs. Bob got the movie made because otherwise there would have been no prints on the screen. That weekend the film did well. I think it was #1.
Beyond any expectation. It just became a big hit. Wes was a wonderful director, and Bob Shaye is fabulous. We have a new producer in town.
It's a hit. People were lining up down Broadway to see this movie. It was like live theater. I mean, people were running down the aisles, talking to the screen.
Don't go there, don't go up the stairs, you know, girlfriend.
Don't fall asleep, he's behind you. They were seeing something that they had never seen before. It was a confirmation of all these things that Wes had been trying to make people understand for years. He was so right.
As it played, its reputation grew.
All over the country. It wasn't just a New York movie or a Los Angeles movie.
Nightmare on Elm Street played for everybody in all cultures because everybody has to fall asleep at night.
It became a cultural phenomenon.
I did a show once with Robert, and as soon as Robert walked out, the kids stood up and started chanting, "Freddy, Freddy."
I have never liked him in the way that his fans liked him. I always felt like he was like the sickest, most depraved, disgusting, evil, devil character. That's what's wrong with our world. Are the Freddy Kruegers in our world.
I was watching television one night, and the President of the United States referred to Freddy Krueger.
The truth is that when you take a walk down our opposition's memory lane, it starts to look like Nightmare on Elm Street.
It's become part of the culture. You have no control over that, and it goes where it's going to go.
Through video, it had such a huge following. That's when people would come up to me, and I was like, oh my gosh.
There's millions of fans now. They just love every single moment of that film, and they've memorized every line.
This is just a dream. This isn't real.
And then there's girls who really love Nancy and are inspired by her strength. It's just amazing to me.
I don't think it's an accident that A Nightmare on Elm Street would come to be made in the mid-'80s. We had AIDS, we had an economy that was going to collapse, and in the midst of this you get this vision. All right, we're going to show you Elm Street.
It's the disintegrating middle class, the single parents, and alcoholic parents, and neglectful parents. Freddy's punishing white bread America.
This is a film about people being put in jeopardy by lies.
You knew about him all this time? And you've been acting like it was something I made up?
Freddy wants to destroy you because you are innocent in your youth and you have your whole life ahead of you.
Freddy kind of spits the last minutes of adolescence back in the faces of his victims.
Freddy Krueger is in everybody's mind, the boogeyman. You think of Freddy Krueger.
I always think Freddy's in the parking lot when I'm walking in my car at night. You know, I hear an elevator and I think Freddy's going to step out of it. I dream of Freddy all the time. It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing.
1, 2,
Freddy's coming for you.
Nightmare on Elm Street came out of a series of articles in the LA Times, if I'm not mistaken, starting in, I would guess, in the late 70s. They were, as I remember, about 3 to 6 months apart, and they were not correlated. That is, the LA Times, for whatever reasons, did not sort of catch that they had had a story about this before. They were all very small, and essentially they would go like, some young man, usually of Southeast Asian origin, had been reported to have died in the middle of a nightmare. And the first two I clipped and kept without thinking too much about it, and then the third one had really the nub of a story in it. And basically this kid, and he had been he and his family had come out of the relocation camps in Southeast Asia, I think Cambodia, something like that. They were now in the United States, living someplace in California. And he had been troubled by severe nightmares. And they had become, they had increased in intensity to the point where he had told his family, these are not, they don't feel ordinary. And his family had tried to console him and tell him, you know, we've come out of this terrible background. Nightmares are a normal part of your psyche, trying to deal with that. And but he increased in the sense of trying to say, this doesn't feel normal, it feels too real. And at a certain point, they had a doctor prescribe sleeping medicine for him, and his father insisted he take it. And it turned out later that he had taken the pills in you know, under their supervision, and then as soon as they were away, he had spit them out. And they also discovered later that he had a coffee pot in his closet that he had kept with black coffee to stay awake at night. So this had gone on. He had decided at a certain point to stay awake and not sleep. And obviously the family thought he was having something like a nervous breakdown. And after about 3 days, he would be downstairs watching television all through the night. They went down and found him asleep on the couch, and the father brought him back to his bed. And the family, you know, sort of felt like, thank God, he seems to be sleeping peacefully. And they all went to bed. And later in the night, they heard screaming and thrashing about. They ran into his room. And before they could get to him, he fell dead, stone dead. And the family had had an autopsy done, and there was no heart failure. There was no sign of why he had died. That was a story. It was about a 10-inch story instead of you know, the others were 3 or 4-inch stories. And I just read that. I said, this is like, it just evoked something very deep in me, you know.
3, 4, better lock your door.
When I was, I think about 7 years old, I was just about to fall asleep, and I heard this shuffling down the sidewalk and mumbling. And I went to the window. I was in a second-story apartment with, you know, living with my family in Cleveland, and there was this man that looked pretty much like Freddy ended up looking. And I assume now he was probably a drunk, you know, but at that time he was just this dark man. And he stopped, and he happened to look directly up into the window and right into my eyes. Now, I don't know how he knew to stop, how he knew a kid was watching, but somehow he did. And it just stopped my breath in my throat. And I backed away from the window with him just staring at me until he couldn't see me, and stood back there in the shadows and counted, you know. And I don't know what I counted to, 100 or 200 or whatever, but I didn't hear him, and I thought he must have gone by now, but I would have heard him, but he couldn't just be standing there. And I went back, and he was there, and he just went, you know, like this with this big leer. And then he sort of capped himself by starting to walk down the sidewalk, still looking over his shoulder at me, and then turned the corner and walked towards the entrance of our building, which was out of my sight. But so I remember running through the house, dark house, and going to the front door and putting my ear to it and hearing the door downstairs open, you know, the door to the lobby of the building. Whereupon I woke up everybody in the house, you know, everybody in the apartment, and my brother went down with a baseball bat. And by the time I had awakened everybody in the stir, this guy had disappeared. But that memory became the essence of Freddy, because that guy, whoever the hell he was, enjoyed scaring the shit out of a kid. And And, you know, that, extrapolating that and taking that to the nth degree, I think you have the kind of mentality of older men that can send young men off to war, or a generation that always hates the music of a young generation because it's threatening to them, because they are the ones inheriting new life, you know, whereas the older people are the ones inheriting old age. So that became the essence of Freddie. And that man wore a hat like Freddie. So that's the origin of that hat.
5, 6, grab your crucifix.
Nightmare on Elm Street was written after I did Swamp Thing. I'd done 2 pictures back to back, and everybody was saying, you've made it, man. And you got to write your own script. Fantastic. Went off and wrote it, and absolutely nobody thought it was scary. Nobody thought it was good, except for Bob Shaye.
7, 8, gonna stay up late.
We were a very small company that was effectively distributing films to college campuses. And we had just decided to branch into theatrical distribution, actually with Reefer Madness, in fact. And I had a friend of mine who was an American guy who happened to be living in London, who was a producer named Mark Forstatter. And we were based in New York, and Los Angeles was really kind of forbidden, mystical territory. I didn't go out there very often at all. And Mark said, no, you guys, we're in the movie business, and I want to produce a film for you, so let's go and meet some of the hot young directors in Hollywood.
What happened at the beginning of the 80s, I guess starting with Halloween and Friday the 13th, is that there was a time when you could tell that kind of a story to a receptive audience. They could come for special effects that they hadn't seen before, that the film was being presented in a way that hadn't been seen before. Now, Friday the 13th, as it turns out, was the first film that was ever released nationally by anybody. Up until then, it had been The Ugly Stepchild. And films were things on big budgets that had stars and could be shown to anybody or any place. And in 1980, Frank Mancuso, who was running distribution at Paramount, said, I want to take a shot on this one. He just got a big kick out of it, had a hunch, and basically he bet his whole career on whether or not Friday the 13th would work. It had never been done before. And went through the roof, and suddenly everybody said, whoa, let's start doing that. And they made more Friday the 13th. They made more Halloweens. Wes had for 3 or 4 years been nursing this notion of trying to do a horror film that involved dreams interacting with real life. I remember telling him, I said, Wes, I don't think anybody's ever going to buy into that. You think anybody's going to? And he said, absolutely, I know it can work. I said, geez, I don't know. He says, no, I know it can work. And as it turned out, Bob Shaye was the only one who really got it and really believed in it.
Bob Shaye, who I had met through, I forget, a mutual friend in New York. We had shaken hands, and he had said, I like your films. At that time, it was, I think, Last House and The Hills of Eyes that he had seen. I'd like to do something with you sometime. Do you have any ideas? And I described this idea. He said, I really like that.
So I asked Wes if he would send me the script, and he sort of mumbled, well, it was other people were looking at it, and he tried to get me a copy. But I was quite fascinated by it. And I continued to call Wes on a regular basis until he finally did send the script. And it was at that point that we began to make a deal to take an option on the script and on Wes's services so that we could develop it. And that was kind of that was literally the genesis of our involvement with Nightmare on Elm Street.
He went off on something that took him 3 years to raise money for that. Meanwhile, I impatiently sent it to everybody in Hollywood, and everybody rejected it for various reasons. Either it wasn't scary. Sean Cunningham, who should know horror, said, I don't think people will be afraid of it because it happens in dreams, and they'll know it's a dream, so they won't be afraid. A lot of studios rejected it because horror was going through a period where it was considered politically non-correct, and it was considered dead, which is, I've observed this, having done this going on 25 years or more, that horror goes through these cycles where everybody says it's improper and it's dead and we'll never have it again, and then suddenly it comes back like gangbusters.
The problem was that New Line not only didn't have any money, but we didn't even, we had a bank line of, I think, $100,000, but the bank line specifically prohibited us from using any of that money for film production. So I had to take this script and begin to try to raise money through pre-sales and trying to find equity partners to raise the $600,000, which eventually became, I think, $1.1 million, to finance the project.
And I collected a huge stack of rejection letters saying thank you very much, but we don't think it's for us, or we don't think it's scary. And then finally, Bob Shaye was able to put together about half of the budget that I thought I needed. And I decided, well, it's either now or never, so we went ahead and did it.
9, 10, never sleep again.
I wanted somebody for Nancy that was, first of all, very non-Hollywood. I wanted somebody that I felt like really could live next door, you know, not like the beautiful blonde sort of Bembette, but somebody like was your babysitter, or, you know, somebody you would trust and was non-glam and had a real head on her shoulders and had courage in her face somehow. And Heather had that. She had that sort of genuine through and through feel and a sense of sort of personal courage about her that I really liked a lot. And I just thought she had the that sort of brunette quality, you know, of something real. And I don't think she was terribly difficult to find. I mean, once she came in, I sort of recognized her.
The beginning of these films for me was, I believe it was my second audition for the film. I went to a casting office in Hollywood, and it was very crowded. There were, it seemed like 12 or 15, you know, young women, and we were each going in one by one, and I got to go in with Amanda Wyss, and we went in together, and I read for Wes, and I remember during the reading, I was just compelled to make my fingers into this shape and say, it was just a part in the dialogue where I'm describing my dream, and I just had this little claw that just became alive somehow, and I think Wes really liked that, and he let everybody go except for me, and he came out and he said, "I'd like you to know that I'd like you to be Nancy," and that never happens in Hollywood. They always have your agent call your people, and it's never like that, and that's the kind of man Wes was. He's so. I just felt like he and I started out on a very strong footing because he was so open and warm, and for an actress to be told at the audition that you're going to work, I mean, it was a great day. I went right to the gas station and went to full service, which is what I always do when I get a part. I always feel like, I'm going to make it.
The more difficult thing was Freddie, and it was, by the time I had made enough films that I knew that quite often a scary film will absolutely depend on the casting of the villain. And if you don't have somebody who can really personally scare and is willing to scare and able to go into those places in himself to find that sort of element, you're doomed. The film will not work. And Freddie was originally written to be an older man, too. I was looking originally at men in their 60s and 70s, frankly, and could not find anybody that had the wherewithal to come up with that kind of energy.
I had just actually broken up with a girl that I'd been with for a long time, and I was out in the clubs on Saturday nights because it was my one night off, and there was a great musical renaissance going on in Los Angeles then, and the club scene was really fun and not too hyped and really inexpensive. And I can remember going to a couple of the goth bars in those days, the early sort of gloom and doom bars, and seeing clips of Wes's old movies, The Hills Have Eyes, Last House on the Left. So Wes had, in terms of actors and artists and the club scene and all that, Wes had a kind of a great underground reputation back then.
Robert sort of came in on a fluke, and first thing I thought is he's much too young, and he doesn't look at all like I imagine Freddie, which was wrinkled and kind of evil-looking Robert. It's kind of cheerful and high energy and everything else, but he had a fantastic energy and willingness to play it and an enthusiasm for it. And ultimately, that's what won me over. Because I'd found that where actors fail playing evil is that certain people simply are unwilling to admit that that's in them. It's my theory that it's in all of us. And you can tap into it, and it doesn't mean that that is what you are, but you simply acknowledge that part of you. And for an actor, he has to be able to relish, being really, really nasty. And Robert was able to go there.
I always felt when we were filming the first movie that it's rare in modern films, and certainly the films that I've seen in my life, where the protagonist and the antagonist are so clearly defined and actually represent good and evil with no equivocation at all. And Robert Englund and I talked a lot about the underlying, symbolism of our battle. And Robert is a very intelligent person and very highly trained actor. So he, in a lot of ways, encouraged me to think of the battle on much more, archetypal level, if I can use that word. And he and I even today talk about it as if we're talking about a Greek tragedy. We've never thought of it literally as popular teenager slasher film. We always have had the respect for it that Wes was able to create a modern myth about, the struggle between good and evil. And as the issues of Nancy's became more developed, first you just see her as a teenager, then you see her as the child of a divorced family, and then you see her as a person who's very concerned about her friends. And then in the later films, she's trying to take care of teenagers and a social worker type, and then finally she's a mother of her own child and a wife. She, and we often, Wes is very, I think, concerned that her story was always toward the good and what our ideals and virtues are all about in our society. And we always talked about those things. And Robert and I, we enjoyed being enemies, and we were always, playing those kind of tricks and stuff on each other as that.
And there is some kind of Cocteau Beauty and the Beast thing between Heather and I. And I don't know what it is, but there is a dance between Heather and I that has sort of become archetypical. And the audiences respond to that on a subliminal level. There's something about us, they don't want to see us get it on, but they'd like to see us butt heads. I think they'd like to see Freddie force a kiss on her. They'd like to see her as a heroine in jeopardy as a direct result of Freddie. It's almost as if Heather somehow, because of her beauty, and she has a sort of a subliminal American beauty that American beauty that I think works as a heroine. And I think that the corruption of Heather by the evil of Freddie is there's a chemistry there that audiences really responded to. Nancy, Freddie, I call it Heather because it's Heather that is Heather's own charisma as a personality, that and a look, actually the way Heather looks, and it's a plausible beauty that I think makes the Nightmare on Elm Street movies not just a horror film and not just a great cultural parenthetical from the 80s into the 90s, not just a Beauty and the Beast thing, but it also makes it, in the most popcorn terms, a date movie.
I wanted Freddie to be able to shape change, because I was aware in mythology that was an important thing, and I thought at times he should be able to get out of the symbology of his own body into something greater. So I wanted him to have something instantly recognizable. So it was gave him a sweater with stripes, and made them that sort of shade of green and red that I had found in a book of colors that were great, that are hard on the eye. So that is one of the hardest combinations of colors for the eye to process, those two shades. So that was that. And then it was like, all right, so what weapons does he have? What weapon does he have? And, you know, by that time, there had been a lot of films with a lot of specialized weapons and chainsaws and butcher knives and everything else. And I said, okay, you're looking for something that is ancient, something that stands for something that's been around as long as you can imagine. What has been around? Well, obviously the draw, if you will, of all these weapons is that they are edged weapons, which is the simplest and most ancient weapon there is, because nature is full of edged weapons, you know, saber-toothed tigers and incisors and claws and talons and everything else, and horns. And so I said, okay, let's take a combination of the human hand, which is the epitome of mankind, the dexterity of the human hand, and combine that with the claw that I'm sure the most primeval man was cowering from around the corner in some cave with a cave bear or a tiger or something trying to reach him, and put those two things together. So that was the combination of that. And that kind of makes up Freddy, I think. You know, that was the basis. And then putting him basically in the labyrinth, in the Hades, in the hell of a boiler room, was just to put him in that kind of mysterious, dark place that's underneath what society gives to kids at his school.
Probably the reason they've never replaced me is probably because of the walk and the body language of the character, which is all me. And I brought it, and there's a lot of reasons for it, and Wes certainly encouraged it and liked it. But you know, the makeup design, for instance, is really, a lot of that goes to Bob Shaye and to Wes Craven and to Dave Miller sitting around. I can remember going in and being part of those sessions and listening, and things were discarded and things were retained and some things didn't work. I know Bob Shaye had always wanted Freddy to look more melted, and he really wanted flanges of melted flesh and stuff, which is actually scientifically correct to the way burn victims do look for a while. But it does look great when you move and it becomes backlit. But it also, when you move, it can also become silly a little bit. It looks a little dangly, and it's like an actor who moves and his hair and after he stops moving, his hair keeps shaking. It kind of looks a little silly sometimes.
So then it became a factor of how do we make him look old, and how do we... And so we sort of, I think, it just really emphasized the scarring as a much more outlandish element of his. And it added to the mask-like quality of it, too, which I thought was good.
Jim Doyle, the special effects guy, brought me in on the first Nightmare on Elm Street and had me meet with Wes Craven. And Wes took me to lunch, very nice guy, more like a college professor than a director. And he just basically, discussed the film and his concepts for Freddy, and just basically explained he's a burned up figure. He should be really scary looking, and you should see a lot of muscle under his skin, with open sores and holes, and really disgusting to look at. And he said he was going to light it very dark, so everything should be like overly done, so you can really see it well. And one night I was eating pizza in a pizza parlor and was just kind of playing with the cheese with my fork. It was a pepperoni pizza. So I was kind of rearranging the cheese around the pepperoni, and I thought, this looks good. So instead of eating it, I just took it home and and used that as a guideline for creating Freddy's face.
The hat that Freddy wears was originally described by Wes in the very first script, but Wes, trying to cast, the Johnny Depp role and the Heather Langenkamp role and the parents, and looking at all the potential effects and the limits of the budget on the first one, and dealing with all of these things, Wes at one point lost his confidence in the snap brim hat, which he had described to me in our very first meeting, and which was in the script. And I remember one day showing up in this little closet of a dressing room with this terrible couch with cigarette burns all over it, and Wes and Bob Shaye sitting there on this sort of funny 70s
Bette Midler love seat, you know, that had been left over from how many countless movies, dressing rooms. And the two of them sitting there on the broken springs of this thing kind of sunk in because they're both big guys. And me changing hats, and it was like a Laurel and Hardy routine, you know, or an old vaudeville routine. And I had to put me paperboy hats on, and caps, and all these different hats, and they were all ludicrous. And I remember I had fought for the original snap brim hat and wanted it distressed and soiled and frayed. And it was Wes's original vision, but he had kind of lost confidence because he had so many other decisions to make, and he was being, I don't know whether it was wardrobe that led him astray or what, but I remember like knowing, you know, Wes, you got to stick with this is right. This original vision of yours that you described to me on the first interview, and it's in the script. This is right. This is really, he needs this. And I think I said something like, well, we can hide an eye under it. You know, we can always hide one eye, and that'll be good. We can get the light underneath, or we can catch the light in this eye. And we can, you know, there's a lot of makeup and effect, and we'll hide, and we can reveal the bald head, then we'll have that reveal potential. And after a while, after several of the Nightmare movies, I really liked playing him bald, because that was such a great, this is before we had every goddamn villain in low-budget horror movies or in action movies. Now we always have to have an obligatory bald guy with one earring now. But way before that, way before you had one guy with a contact lens with a head shave, which is all, as far as I'm concerned, an echo of Freddy, even up to the heights of quality of Martin Scorsese and his remake with Mr. De Niro, you know, of Cape Fear. I see echoes of Freddy in that climax, and I see this influence a lot. And you know, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, even if it's subconsciously. But this was the first time you had a bald, melted villain, you know, that could reveal that. And so that whole design element in the hat and the body language, I take kind of credit for at least maintaining the hat.
There was a nose, an upper lip piece, separate cheek pieces, a forehead piece, and then the back of the head piece. I don't know, I've lost count now. But there was a separate ear, because it was supposed to look like his ear was burned off, so his real ear was under the appliance, and the fake ear was on top. So there was like a lot of holes in it, so when it was backlit, you could see light through it. And they were all just pre-painted, so when I got on set, it'd be easy to just blend them together with makeup around the seams. So the whole process it started out taking about 3.5 hours to put on, which is a long time to sit in the morning. He would fall asleep sometimes, and I just wake him up when I was done.
Being under all that makeup, I was sort of liberated, and I was able to really perform with quotes again, because I had just hit that point as a film actor where you really start getting into that indulgent behavioral work. And you know, the more you watch that film acting, you can see a lot of stuff that we call real is just this sort of behavioral soap opera acting. You see people taking all this time now in film acting, especially in talking head television, where everybody takes their moment, as they say on Ally McBeal. And that's not how people are in real life. People talk a mile a minute, they're on their cell phones, they're overlapping, they're interrupting each other like Italians do. They're doing those parentheticals. And what Freddy did for me was I was able to physicalize, move differently than Robert Englund could. I was able to pose, you know, kind of like, you know, music videos has embraced that kind of posing kind of thing again. I was able to make myself look bigger than I am. I was able to make myself look tougher than I am. I was able to play myself older than I was when I began Freddy, certainly. I changed my voice for the role. And every once in a while, I was able to use that clown element, as you suggested, the cruel clown, kind of mixing that kind of vaudeville energy with a kind of sadistic, you know, undercurrent, which was really fun to do.
Well, the thing I remember most about Nightmare 1 was how precarious it was financially, because New Line didn't have a lot of money at that time. We had been around for a while, but we were always hand to mouth, and we didn't have a great deal of money, and we'd put so much into developing this project and getting it where it was, and everything seemed to be rolling fine. And 2 weeks before we started to shoot, something happened with, I think it was our video deal. We lost a deal that had been one of the major pieces of the money, fell apart. So Bob said, Sarah said, I want you to go to LA and sit with the crew and the cast and tell them the situation and tell them we need them to trust us and hang in there, and we'll get a new deal together, and you know, they'll all be paid. But I was 6 months pregnant at this time, and I went to California and I called these 100 people together, and I said, I have the bad news is, you know, we just don't have any money to pay you this week. But the good news is we're going to be able to. We know that we will. You just have to trust me. And all these people looked at this 6-month pregnant woman, and they all told me they had to believe me. They just, you know, and I looked like I was going to cry at one point. I said, you know, we can't lose any one of you. You all are a really wonderful crew. And if, you know, just trust us and work this week, and we'll get you your money hopefully by next week. As it was, 2 weeks went by and we couldn't pay anyone. And we didn't lose one crew member. We never lost anyone on the shoot. They stayed with us.
By the time, I suppose it was 1984, Nightmare on Elm Street came in. I remember the movie almost didn't get made. It was a last-minute problem of some sort, and somebody came in and put in some funds. But I remember the very first day when I met Wes Craven. It was a scene at a cemetery. And I told him quite honestly that I really liked the story idea. That is to say, my own intense interest in psychology latched onto the possibilities and the implications of dream stuff, giving dreams as sort of equal reality, the story seemed to be suggesting. That dreams were the stuff of which real whatever emotions were made of, violence, troubles, and stuff like that.
I introduced myself to John Saxon the first day of shooting, which was in the cemetery scene when one of the characters is being buried, obviously. And John Saxon, who I just said, hi, I'm Bob Shaye, and he says, I don't know what I'm doing on this movie. He said, I don't know who these people are, and do you know anything about them? So I said, yeah, I think they're really good people, and then I walked away. And then I really kind of overstepped my producerial duties with Wes, who had some experience making movies, certainly more than I had, when he was doing a fourth or fifth take of some scene, and I said, well, you know, I think that's enough, let's move on, because I was scared to death that we were not going to be able to make this movie with the financing that we had, and we had a completion guarantor that was looking over our shoulder the whole time, and it was just, the whole thing was and I had a responsibility to the home video company that in case one day's dailies were behind, or any of what, they could take over the whole film, take away our equity interest, take away our distribution fees, and take away our distribution activities, and just totally take over the film. So he had all of these ogres sitting on my shoulder. So I told Wes, I said, I think that's enough, let's move on. And Wes turned around to me and he said, wait a second. He said, if you think you're going to rush me through this movie, you're out of your mind. Now go sit over there and be quiet. So I said, okay.
We had a good time. I remember having a very good time. It was a great crew. We had a lot of fun. At that time, I had decided, I had read an article by Truffaut saying that the thing that strikes respect in people's minds more than anything else is wearing a tie, glasses, and a hearing aid. So I had experimented with wearing glasses and a tie, and I sort of settled on wearing a tie and a checkered shirt every day for the hell of it. So after a while, the crew started showing up and doing. They would do specialty days, and one day everybody showed up wearing a checkered shirt and a tie. Jacques Haken, who was shooting the picture, would wear an eye patch over the eye that wasn't looking through the viewfinder. And he had this theory that allowed you to look normally and not have any distractions. So one day he turned around and we were all wearing eye patches, which completely infuriated Jacques. But one day they had a Nancy Day, and everybody came to work in nightgowns and pajamas, and I remember the gaffer wearing slippers with bunnies on them, you know. So we had a lot of fun that way.
I always imagined that the kiss between me and Johnny Depp would be really romantic and well, something that I might remember for the rest of my life. And I frankly don't really remember it that well because Wes kept cutting it down in its scope because he wanted me to be preoccupied with my, problems and the tension of the night. He didn't think that I'd just give myself over to passion. And so I think, too, Johnny and I were both new actors on the scene, and we hadn't probably ever had kisses on screen. And, I mean, no offense to Johnny, but I probably looked really stupid. And so I feel like perhaps it was just kept very brief and modest because, just for the sake of the audience. Things weren't quite so racy back then either. I don't think people like to see teenagers totally making out.
It was difficult. We shot it in 32 days. I think our schedule was originally 30 days, so it was like a very tight shoot. At one time, actually, Sean came in and shot the second unit for me. And I think the last several days we were shooting with, if I'm not mistaken, something like 5 units shooting at the same time on the same stage, and I was going from one to the other, setting up shots and shooting and then going over to the next setup when it was ready. I know Freddie building his glove and Nancy sinking down into the steps, the mother being sucked through the front door, and I think Rod's sheet coming around him in the prison cell were all being shot simultaneously, along with a main speaking scene.
I was looking to try to get some money for the company, and we thought, well, maybe we should not distribute this movie, but maybe we should just sell it to an international distributor and to a domestic distributor. And our lawyer at that time was a guy named Michael Lynn, who I'd gone to law school with, who subsequently is now president of New Line, but at that time he was our outside lawyer, and he was also Sean Cunningham's lawyer, and he had sold Friday the 13th to Paramount. So he called me up and he said, listen, I think that you got a good movie here, but I bet you I could get you $2 million or $3 million for it from Paramount. And the film cost $1.1 million. I was looking at a $900,000 profit, even though we had to share a lot of it with a great deal of it with our investors. It would at least get us out and get us to move on to something else. So we set up a screening for the film for Frank Mancuso, and who was then head of Paramount, and their whole marketing department. It was on a Saturday morning. And we had been trying all kinds of different endings to the movie, and tried one and then the other and a third, and finally we came up with one ending that seemed to work the best. So they wouldn't let me sit in the screening room, but I was with the editor in the projection booth while we're showing the film to these Paramount executives. And they would let the editors, by the way, sit in the screening room just because he was doing the mixing, because we couldn't afford to get a mix, even though it was double system, which means the sound and the picture were separate. But they wouldn't let me sit in the room, but I'm standing in the projection booth watching them, and suddenly I see the editor stand up and walk out of the room and come into the projection booth. I said, what's wrong? What's going on? He said, I just remembered we don't have the right ending on the end of the movie. And the ending we have is one that we really tested the worst of all of the endings. So I said, oh my God, what are we going to do? He said, well, the ending's across the street in the editing room. And I said, well, we've got 17 minutes. It's like the last reel is on the thing. Hurry. So he runs and he runs across the street, comes back in, and it's on the rewind, and we're racing to get it the last reel out to cut the other thing off, and the film is running through the projector, and it's about ready to run out, and all these guys are sitting there. I got a phone call from the head of acquisitions about an hour or two later. So we're not going to take the picture. And I said, why? And he said, because if you remember this movie that we just released with Joe Rubin about people and their dreams and getting into their dreams, it was a little bit like Brainstorm, actually. He said, and that didn't work for us, and we don't think movies about dreams are going to work. So I said, are you sure there's nothing we can do? And he said, no, there really isn't. I'm sorry, I wish you luck with it, but that's it. So this is one of the great turndowns of all time. Every time I see Frank Mancuso, I tell him, you saved me many, many millions of dollars by, by peeing on my leg, and I don't mind for a second. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the turn down.
But I swear to God, it wasn't until I saw Nightmare all put together that I realized what Wes had always known, is how strong it could be and what a good, fun movie it could be. But it was really up to just the two of them, or the only two that I knew, that really got it from the get-go.
Actually, we knew we had a hit when we had a screening in Baltimore, and John Waters called us afterwards, and he had just gone to see it because John goes, actually no, it was the opening day, and John Waters went to the 10 a.m. show on opening day in Baltimore. And he called us up and said, you've got a hit. And John knows, John sees all of these movies, and he knows what works and what doesn't, because he has a real sense of authenticity. And he felt this was real and the kids would relate to it. And so John gave us one of our first reviews, and he was right.
Rachel's box office computer. Nightmare 1 cost about $1.8 million and made, I believe, about $18 million, but it may have made closer to 20. Nightmare 2 cost about $2.2 million and made, I believe, about $22 million. Nightmare 3 cost about $4.5 million and made something around $40 million. Nightmare 4 cost somewhere under $7 million and made just under 50. Nightmare 5 cost, I believe, and this is the one that I wasn't involved in, so cost about $8 million and made, I think, only 25. And then Nightmare 6 cost, I think, 8.5 and made 35. And I have no idea about Nightmare 7.
Rachel's, I think, one of the people that really knew it was going to go somewhere. And I think Bob's, had different theories over the years. Robert Shea from New Line, I think, he's been proud of it and a little embarrassed and everything, and it's sort of like, his bastard cousin, this Freddy Krueger thing that he's created, And I think Sarah kind of always looked at it as one of a group of things, but Sarah always was sort of like the den mother, because I can remember like when the craft services got better, it usually meant that Sarah was around and things like that. But they're really the people that witnessed every moment of it, the entire genesis. Wes was off doing wonderful projects like Serpent and the Rainbow and creating other things for years, and he'd come back. But Wes was, gone for a while and came back, and then gone for a while and then came back. But those are the people that were really always there.
Bob saw early on the sequel possibilities of it, and he wanted at the end to have something where Freddy was. The script had Nancy coming out on her front porch with her mother at the beginning of the new day, and it was foggy, and her friend showed up in a school bus, and Nancy got in the bus and drove away into the fog. And he didn't quite know whether it was all a dream or what. Bob wanted Freddy to be driving the bus. And my feeling was that completely refuted sort of the victory of Nancy, that she had beat Freddy, and she had faced the demon. And, to make that some sort of a hook for a sequel, first of all, would be kind of demeaning to the film, and I think kind of subvert what the character had achieved. And we did argue about that, and we argued vehemently about it. I don't think we ever screamed on the set. I'm not a screamer. I don't think Bob... Well, he's not a screamer with me. We've never had a screaming fight. And what we did sort of strike a compromise where we devised a shot of a car that had the stripes of Freddy on its convertible roof, and the kids showed up in a car instead of a school bus, and when they all got in, the top came down, and they drove away sort of under the power of the car, and the mother was sucked into the door. It was always something that I hated afterwards. At the same time, I felt I must say, a profound sense of gratitude and that I owed Bob, because, I mean, it was so clear-cut to me that he was the only person that I could find in the world that had the vision and the wherewithal to raise the money for that.
God. It's bright. It's
gonna burn off sooner. It wouldn't be so bright.
Feeling better?
Oh, I feel like $1,000,000. They say you've bottomed out when you can't remember the night before. No, baby, I'm gonna stop drinking. I just don't feel like it anymore. Did I keep you awake last night? You look a little bit peaked.
No. I guess I just slept heavy.
Okay. Well, see ya.
See ya.
Do you believe this fog?
Oh, I believe anything is possible.
You're looking good, girl.
Bye! Bye, Mom.
One, two, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. 7, 8, gonna stay up late. 9, 10, never sleep again.